Welcome back, class. We're going to pick up right where we left off last time and continue our comparison of Stoic and Epicurean doctrines. Last time we examined some core virtues of each school, but today we'll broadly investigate their goals and projects. I'll keep these comparisons simple as always and straightforward where I can, but obviously the finer points can be dissected and debated in depth. As always, we should remember that the founding philosophers designed these doctrines to be easily digested and discussed. You might do the work of Kant or, say, the rather labyrinthine rules of the Death Note a disservice by oversimplifying, but the elegance of Hellenistic thought lies in its ease of comprehension and application. And if you've missed any of our earlier sessions, our trusty TA recorded them for posterity and glory, and I will link them in the description, so please feel free to go back and get caught up. However, you should be able to enjoy this one on its own as well. For now, let's start big with nothing short of the goal of human life as conceived by the Hellenistic philosophers. So let's compare and contrast their views on what the goal of human life was. Epicureans would say that the goal is to pursue happiness through wise choices. They would tell you to avoid distractions like hollow virtue and vanity, and all things that are neither authentic nor sustainable. Remember, Epicureans put a large emphasis on what kind of pleasures can be sustained in the long term. Stoics would say that the goal of life is to pursue virtue by controlling one's own actions and reactions and ceding control over external variables or forms. A good Stoic will learn to love and find meaning in their fate rather than struggling against what they can't control. As they say, amor fati, love your fate. How about truth? Well, if you can handle it, here's how the Hellenists thought to seek it. Epicureans believe that truth is established through empiricism. You may recall from our first lesson that this refers to sensory experience as a way of knowing, pleasure, suffering, and so forth, all that we can perceive with our five senses. This is all tempered with an Epicurean flavor of skepticism, though, which holds that objective truth may not always be discernible, and we should accept this humbly. Epicureans believed that while reason is useful, it has no value when divorced from the senses. In other words, they celebrate reason, but only because its foundation is sensory, and because it's sensory, we can probably trust it. Rather than the senses, Stoics look to dialectical reasoning and logic or syllogisms to clarify truth. This reason is not dependent upon the senses, and in fact, Stoicism often asks students or procoptons to challenge their sensory perceptions with logic before assenting to any truth. How about religion? How did they feel about the existence of a God? Well, we touched on this last session, so I will be brief. Obviously, the finer points of cosmology and theology are always going to be very fine, but broadly speaking, Epicureans did not believe that any god or gods were actively interfering in the lives of universe is to not fear any gods. Stoics believed deeply in the guiding predestination of the universe, the shaping force of all things. And I had a question from the class asking me to clarify why modern Stoicism differs from classical Stoicism. Excellent question, young scholar, in the comments. To reiterate, the fact that the universe had a design for everything in the Stoic worldview was the foundation and, if you will, faith of the classical Stoics. You could put your faith in the universe and therefore accept all that happened as right and good in the grand arc of things, even if you didn't personally understand them. Many modern people still hold to this idea. All is to the plan of their God, and so all will be well. Modern Stoicism is largely agnostic or atheistic in the way it's expressed and digested. I'm not sure how, say, Marcus Aurelius would have processed this. Again and again, we see him and other notable Stoics free themselves from suffering through their belief in a just universe. It functions as raison d'etre for all of Stoic philosophy in my mind. You love fate because fate is sacrosanct and perfect. You only worry about controlling yourself because the rest is out of your hands and you can trust that it's all to a grand design. You act in accordance with nature because it is a divine nature. Now, it's important for me to say that I believe that there is plenty to glean, learn from, and practice in modern agnostic Stoicism. And I think that it resonates with more humanistic audiences of the modern day. I do not say that it's not truly Stoicism because I disagree with its agnosticism. Far from it. I say this because just personally, I don't understand the physics or structure of the philosophy as originally intended without its driving force, if that makes sense. But just because it's different does not mean that modern Stoics don't have value, insight, and integrity. I think I see it more as a kind of reformation. While some of the elegance of the philosophy falls off, it's maybe less clean, it makes more sense, like I said, to modern humanists. The world is increasingly secular in a lot of places, especially in a lot of academic circles. So I hope that helps, and I hope that doesn't sound judgmental at all. I don't often talk much about my religious beliefs or upbringing. As your professor, that's not my role, but I truly, truly respect any belief that leads people to practice kindness and good living, spiritual or not. But I hope that kind of helps. I also believe that the scope and applications of modern agnostic Stoicism are a little bit narrower than originally intended. Stoicism, as originally intended, was meant to be something that you shaped your whole life around. Today, a lot of times I see it used almost in the self-help sphere, in the influencer sphere, and in spheres of business and even sports and things like that, in which you kind of pick and choose pieces of it as motivational work. And there's truly nothing wrong with that. I just, again, want to clarify that if you've seen it picked apart or used in those ways, you may not be understanding fully what the work of classical Stoics was or what their worldview was. So I want to make sure that people understand that there is a bit of a distinction there. Again, I hope that does make sense and I appreciate the question. But let's move on to talking about how these two schools, the Epicureans and the classical Stoics, believe we should perceive pleasure. The role of pleasure in human life was especially relevant in an age where suffering was omnipresent, where warfare had disrupted Greek life in all ways imaginable. It sustained and nourished Roman life and Roman appetite, but it did not come without cost. Either way, the lives of soldiers and their families were not always easy, usually not, and that goes doubly for the poor, for the slaves, so on and so forth. And even everyday domestic experience wasn't safe from plague, other sicknesses, and the risky business of childbearing. So even if you were very well off and protected, it still wasn't necessarily an easy life as we would see it. Still, many citizens of Greece and Rome prospered, and pleasure came in many flavors. In many ways, they had more fun than we. If you've seen Gladiator 2, there is evidence that they actually did bring in boats to arena fights. And like the Greek version of The Bachelorette was having a room full of dudes shoot arrows through axes. At least that's my understanding from reading the Odyssey. Super hardcore. For Epicureans, pleasure is the name of the game. It was seen as the ultimate and primal good, with pain being the ultimate and primal evil. We can confirm the goodness and evil of pleasure and pain through our own senses, right? We don't need anyone to tell us these things. Therefore, we intrinsically know what is pure and right, according to the Epicureans. Essentially, though, there is a limit to the goodness of pleasure. When pleasure exists in excess or without any temperance of pain, it becomes less virtuous. For example, an acquisitive billionaire who enjoys all life's delights with none of its pressures or problems might be seen as defiling the goodness of pleasure. Real pleasure, they would argue, couldn't exist outside of the context of pain, suffering, or stress. Without pain, we cannot truly value and comprehend pleasure. So, the Epicureans believed the experience of pleasure should be deeply processed through the senses, with delights like good food, music, and human bonds, all encouraged within moderation and mindfulness. Now, Stoics conceive of pleasure as uneven and largely dependent upon exteriors or forms. Freedom from suffering, engendered through the development of an impenetrable inner citadel, is the true goal of a Stoic. Freedom from suffering, engendered through the development of an impenetrable inner citadel, is the true goal of a Stoic. A true Stoic sage should cultivate an imperturbably sustainable freedom from pain and suffering through wisdom and good judgment. Now, the inner citadel, the term I just used, is so named by French philosopher Pierre Hadot, and it refers to a calcified set of dispositions and the desire to act justly. Once built within the mind of the Stoic, it is meant to keep worldly grief at bay. For Stoics, the goal must not be volatile happiness, but sturdy mental fortitude. accepting one's circumstances and rising to them with virtue can provide a lifetime of serenity, while the pursuit of pleasure invites a fair share of loss and disruption. While they differed in the details, both schools revered virtue and prescribed their own sets of core values to followers. We discussed the chief virtue of each school earlier, but let's now compare how they conceived of virtue more generally. So, what is virtue? Virtue, more than just a cat from songs by the Weaker Thans. Man, if you haven't heard the Weaker Thans songs about Virtue the cat, go listen and test your stoic resolve not to just ball up and sob. But per Epicurus, prudence was the greatest virtue. There's also a song out there about prudence by some under the radar guys from Liverpool, but it's probably pretty hard to find in its obscurity. But to Epicurus, prudence was the virtue upon which all others were built. For one equipped with prudence was best guided to make choices with pleasurable outcomes. So his prudence is a kind of measured will, allowing Epicureans to choose their actions and their reactions with consideration of potential outcomes and how those might feel. This cardinal virtue was also key to balancing a fair and sustainable pursuit of happiness against a greedy or a vainglorious one. Epicureans train themselves to constantly evaluate decisions with trust in their own senses. Again, that process of classification applies here. The Epicureans' other core virtues are not so different from the Stoics, as you probably saw earlier in our discussion last time. Versions of courage, justice, and temperance were central to both schools. But where prudence reigned supreme for Epicurus, Marcus Aurelius put wisdom at the top of the stack. Now, the Stoic virtue wisdom doesn't preclude good old-fashioned book learning, but the scope of their definition is a bit more narrow than its modern understanding. To Stoics, wisdom is really talking about the virtue allowing us to understand the things we can and cannot control. Generally, we can control our own actions, the thoughts we assent to, or basically allow ourselves to rise to and act on, and little more than that, honestly. But I'd argue, personally, that one thing we can all control are the hairstyles of Geralt of Rivia in Wild Hunt, and nothing can take that away. If you're familiar with the Serenity Prayer, we had it on a magnet and on our refrigerator growing up. I saw it every time I went to get ice cream. You already have a pretty good handle on Stoic wisdom. The Serenity Prayer goes like this: God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. You might notice this wisdom functions largely the way prudence does in Epicureanism, as a compass that guides on the path to other virtue. And therein lies the meaningful difference. Prudence facilitates pleasurable living, while wisdom facilitates virtuous living. Prudence means understanding cause and effect and moving toward the greatest good, while wisdom emphasizes self-control and mastery over suffering. So finally, we'll once again touch upon the Hellenists' understanding of emotion and as emotion as a way of knowing. Epicureans believe wise people will feel emotion deeply and not view it as a hindrance to wisdom. Pleasure is experienced through the senses and the emotions as much as through the intellect or the spirit, and so the value of emotion is often reinforced by Epicurus himself, who tells us, quote, feelings are not an obstacle to wisdom, and that, quote, the tests of truth are the sensations and concepts and the feelings. And while Stoic is often understood to mean blank or emotionless in a modern context as an adjective, Stoics themselves did not advocate robotic apathy. In fact, Stoicism mandates ongoing concern for the well-being of others. Stoics teach the need to reflect on emotions and judgment before assenting to or acting upon them. They further urge us not to judge anything as good or bad, as we do not know the wider arc or design of the universe. There is actually a parable that explains this quite nicely, and while it may not be purely Stoic in origin, it perfectly illustrates the principle in practice. It was often shared by Alan Watts, a prominent Buddhist philosopher, and I think it's worth including here, so I'm going to go ahead and read it to you. And it's often just referred to as the Chinese farmer story. Great title, no notes. So it goes like this. Once upon a time, there was a Chinese farmer whose horse ran away. That evening, all of his neighbors came around to commiserate. They said, "We are so sorry to hear your horse has run away. This is most unfortunate." The farmer said, "Maybe." The next day, the horse came back, bringing 7 wild horses with it, and in the evening, everybody came back and said, "Oh, isn't that lucky? What a great turn of events. You now have 8 horses." And the farmer again said, "Maybe." The following day, his son tried to break one of the horses, and while riding it, he was thrown and broke his leg. The neighbors then said, "Oh dear, that's too bad." And the farmer responded, "You guessed it, maybe." The next day, the conscription officers came around to conscript people into the army, and they rejected his son because he had a broken leg. Again, all the neighbors came around and said, "Isn't that great?" Again, he said, "Maybe." So, we see the whole process of nature is an integrated process of immense complexity, and it's really impossible to tell whether anything that happens in it is good or bad, because you never know what will be the consequence of the misfortune, or you never know what will be the consequences of good fortune. In many ways, Epicureans and Stoics had similar work here to free people from suffering. And both schools are often misrepresented in today's world. Unchecked Epicurean hedonists and unfeeling Stoic killjoys are the caricatures often evoked in modern minds when we think of these groups. But a good Epicurean is guided to pleasure through thoughtful reflection. A good Epicurean does not steal from a neighbor because they weigh the stress and suffering of guilt and the fear of getting caught against the momentary victory or the momentary gain. A good Epicurean does not take more than their fair share because it could influence others to do the same, bring them shame and alienation in their society, and even hurt themselves physically from overindulgence in, say, the food, drink, or substance. In summation, Epicureans are good people, good friends, and a really good time. Invite them to your parties. Stoics, for their part, believe understanding others, their needs, their perspectives, is fundamental to a just existence. They stay calm in a storm and prepared for every eventuality. I once heard someone explain it like this. If the world were ending in an assault of, say, meteors or raptors, or however you think the world might end, the Stoics would be down in the crowd, trying to administer medical aid, kind counsel, and save whomever they could. The Epicureans would be sitting safely up on a rooftop, noshing on snacks, watching the whole thing burn. The Stoics would preserve justice and courage until the very end, and the Epicureans would enjoy every single moment afforded to them with friends nearby. This isn't a perfect metaphor, but I think there's some truth in it. So, the next time you need guidance, I have a couple options you might try inspired by our lesson today. In the face of a lot of stress or strife outside of their own control, a Stoic might say, "This does not concern me." Epictetus said that a lot. If something is outside your control, meaning your direct and honest actions will not change it, just say this aloud. This does not concern me. There is nothing more freeing, except maybe canceling plans when you're really, really tired, but almost nothing more freeing than being able to tell yourself, I don't have to care about this. You'll actually feel the weight lift as your shoulders sort of untense. Really, if something keeps playing again and again and your mind is stressing you, try saying, this does not concern me. I don't have to care about this. And truly, it can feel like magic at times. Now, an Epicurean might say, okay, this is actually Ram Dass, but be here now. Life is not for toiling, hustling, owning, or conquering. Life is for living. Hug your spouse, pet your cat, bake, climb, read, dance, play Expedition 33, eat the pot of cheese, because we are here today and today is most excellent. We get a lot of messaging that we should be accomplishing more, producing more, earning more. Honestly, there's a good chance that you've gotten an ad on this very video about how procrastination is ruining your life and how you need to stop watching YouTube videos and just subscribe to this simple class or app, and they'll show you how to accomplish more with less. But I'm telling you, if you're lucky enough to have a moment or an afternoon or a little time each day to just live, try doing that. You don't have to feel bad about living and enjoying your life, however that looks, as long as it's not hurting anyone. And if you try either of these or both of them, I'd love to hear if they help. Modern dialectical behavior therapy is largely based on Stoicism. I've mentioned that before. So there's truly lots and lots of evidence that these Hellenistic ideas are both relevant and extremely effective to modern people. And how wild is that? If people are still watching this in thousands of years, I'll be super dead actually, but deadly honored as I am because you are right here and you deserve nothing short of eudaimonia. Sounds like a disease, doesn't it? But it's truly the best thing I can wish for you, and I do. I thank you for being such a great class, and I'll see you next time.